Do you like comics? Do you like Bollix? Do you like people being Prolix? Then you're in luck, because this is Prolix Comics Bollix.
All right.
Hello.
Clive.
You.
It's Clive up there, or wherever he is on the screen, down there maybe. And I'm Nick. And Clive, you are going to tell us what you have queued up for us today. What are we talking about here?
Right, yeah, so I went for a bit of nostalgia this time. And I was keen to talk about the comics character JANUS Stark. And,
wait, sorry. JANUS? I downloaded something called ANUS Stark.
Oh no!
It's about a fella who can wedge himself into really. Anyway, no. In fact, that was a gag, folks.
Right, and a great one it was too.
Oh, indeed. So yes, JANUS Stark. Here it is. Grab my copy from the Kindle, or for the Kindle.
Although, if anyone knows, if there is an JANUS Stark, I want to read it.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we could create that together, Clive.
There we go. I knew we'd have to get together on a comic one day.
Yeah, there we go.
This might be our calling.
So JANUS Stark, tell us just a little bit about. Well, how did you even discover? Because I have to say, being somewhat familiar with kind of comics, English comics, British comics of the 60s and 70s, this wasn't actually a character that I had heard of before. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. See, now I don't actually remember where I would have read JANUS Stark. So originally he was in a comic I don't think I was familiar with, Smash Comics, right?
Yes, yeah.
Do you remember Smash Comics?
No, I remember Wham, which is, I think they're related. Like there was a couple of them. They all had these kind of very action-sounding titles, and I'm excited to talk about them. And I mean, they may have been, Buster may have been in there as well. There was a couple of these that had this weird mix. Because I think people who don't read or haven't read English comics don't necessarily know that. I mean, we talked about this before, but the whole weekly thing versus a monthly thing, the whole anthology thing versus, one story, one character across an entire issue. But the one thing that growing up, I always thought that English comics did do was create a fairly clear divide between the comedy stuff, like your Beano and your Dandy and your stuff like that, which is make 1 to 2 page gags with kind of stuff, and your adventure stuff, or your sports stuff. So you've got your Roy of the Rovers and that stuff, or you've got your Valiant. Yeah. So you got your sports things. You've got your Valiant, which is more your or battle and things like where you're gonna have your war stories or your cowboy stories or whatever that stuff is. But Smash was all of these things.
Interesting.
Smash, yeah. Like so, it had, and so it had people like I don't know if Baxendale, if you don't know who he is, you probably do, but he's the guy who did Me, the Minx, and a bunch of those kind of things. He may have worked for them for a little bit.
Yes, he did. Like, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page now. He had quite a few strips in there. Bad Penny, which sounds very Minnie the Minxy. The Man from Bungle, Grimly.
Oh, but the Man from Bungle, yeah, that was, yeah.
Grimly Fiendish, which actually sounds, that's ringing a bell.
Because that apparently continued on past Smash's end, and it looks very Charles Addams. It's obviously inspired in part by the Addams. The character's very Uncle Fester looking, and
he was the guy behind Bastard Kids as well, and for those type of comics, I think you can properly refer to him as a genius of that type of stuff. If
we're going to talk about like Japanese comics, we tend to go back to Tezuka. I think if you're talking about British kids comics, I think Baxendale is that same kind of figure. And then there's a guy called Tom Patterson, who we may or may not talk about in the future, who I think is his successor in British.
Squelchy things. We should have squelchy things around the.
There should be a stinky sock. Yeah, I'll have a stinky sock here the day we do that talk.
I used to, we'll talk about that more, but I used to love looking for the squelchy things.
Oh yes, yes.
But you're quite right. I was just looking at here as well. Other things it seems to have had is something called the Ghost Patrol by Gary Ember, which was a World War II story about time travelers.
Oh, shoot.
Sound...
Hang on. Okay, continue to talk. Just continue to talk.
Yeah, I can always talk. Yeah.
So the other, you should also, if you're reading through the Wikipedia entry right now, notice that there's a whole period of 3 years where they published, or republished, should I say, a crap ton of Stan Lee. It's the first appearances of the Hulk, the first appearances of Thor, the Fantastic Four, all appear in Wham or in the other related things. And that was interesting to me, because I remember growing up talking to my mom about comics, and she would mention every now and again having read things like Fantastic Four or The Incredible Hulk, and I was like, well, how? Because when I was growing up in Ireland in the early 80s, the only place to get American comics was to travel from my hometown in Wicklow all the way up to Dublin and go to the Virgin Megastore or to Forbidden Planet, where they would have those kind of mylar bagged, like with the backboard in them, like, issues of American comics.
Right.
As I was like, so you couldn't go to the newsagent, but I couldn't go like, they only had English comics.
Yeah.
Basically.
It's funny. There seems to have been these different strata of, like, you had your bog standard newsagent, which you would have had, most villages would have had, I would have had, and yes, you'd have had no problem getting your Beanos and Dandies and Commando and War Battle and whatever. Tammy, was that a magazine?
Yes.
Yeah, but
yeah.
That kind of thing. But then, and it was never in your village. You were never lucky enough to have it in your town. But there were, I remember, like, I don't know what you'd call them, like super, like newsagents on steroids or something, that just seemed to have like everything.
Yes.
Like, I remember there was one you come out and you'd go in and it would be like, like they just have like, wow, why does not all, they'd have all these, the newer American things as well, like Fantastic Four and stuff like that. And there was another one near my school, I remember, which we had a weird mix of, like, it would have a lot of weird things, but they'd have like one copy of something and no one had bought it, so they hadn't continued getting it. So you'd buy like an issue of like Hulk or whatever it was, and you'd discover, oh, this is from 5 years ago or something like that.
Yes.
Which is weird, because that's kind of like a proper specialty comic shop, right? That they would have back issues, but just by accident he had back issues.
Right.
Yeah. So you could find them sometimes, but no. But the other story as well, I remember here. I can't remember where I heard this, and you've probably heard this as well in the same place. And it's always a story that's captured my imagination. And there's this story, right, that once upon a time, like before our time, but once upon a time, before that stuff was even really properly released in the UK at all, there's this story about comic books being ballast in ships, right? Like they would have like stacks of comic ships being used in ballast, and then ships would come over from the States, and like, sometimes they just throw them on the beach, on the docks. These like kind of very damp, I would imagine.
Right.
And kids would salvage, like, comics maybe somewhere in the middle of the stack that were in halfway decent condition. So apparently a lot of people were turned onto American comics just by refuse on the beach.
Finding them blowing in the wind. That's
I've
awesome.
not heard that story before.
No, I don't think so, no.
I can't remember where I heard it, but I think it's a legit thing. But that's fascinating to me that was someone's.
But I don't think they were held in very high esteem. So that's not that, in a way, that's not that surprising. But so one thing I was going to say, so I'm wondering if the Phantom Patrol, which is about a bunch of soldiers traveling through time, is a retitling of Ghost Patrol, which you can find in the 1979-2000 AD annual with this beautiful Kevin O'Neill, very early work by Kevin O'Neill cover there.
Speaking of Kevin O'Neill, one thing, sorry, tangent again, but I didn't realize. So we've spoken before off air about when Quality Comics in the US reprinted 2000 strips,
stories, yeah,
colored them and stretched them to fit the format and all that, and are kind of hated by 2008 purists, right? But I always remember loving the Quality Comics covers. Like, I thought they were amazing. The covers they did for like whatever Rogue Trooper and stuff like that. So I didn't realize that apparently Kevin O'Neill drew quite a lot of the Quality Comics covers.
Okay,
but that makes sense.
I didn't know that either.
No,
but Kevin O'Neill is fantastic. We will talk about him. I think in an upcoming episode. I have something else that I want. Well, we'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, he's up there with Baxendale, right?
Yeah, he's just so good. Yeah. So I mean, I guess we're going down all kinds of rabbit holes here, but that's all right. That's what the show's about. Fine. I may not have as much to actually say about
JANUS Stark.
JANUS Stark in the end, but that's fine.
I'm noticing here as well on the Wikipedia, so in 1968 it merged with POW.
yes. Smash and POW together.
When 2080 and Star-Lord, was that?
Star-Lord, and then Tornado, I think, was also absorbed into there. There was at least 2 or 3 different comics absorbed.
Gentle viewer, please forgive our over-enthusiastic nostalgia
for early 80s and late 70s British comics. So anyway, there's this run of several years where they're reprinting all of this, which is great to think like alongside. So you would have maybe had a Baxendale strip, and then suddenly 4 pages of the Incredible Hulk, and then something like Ghost Patrol or some weird English written thing, possibly drawn by an Argentinian, and then you get back. Yeah, just like what a strange comic Wham must have been in the 60s.
Sounds great. It sounds like the kind of thing, if I'd have known about it, I think I probably would have subscribed to it at my local newsagent.
And so apparently they used to have to also cut out, because, like you were saying, the issue with Quality Comics was that they couldn't figure out a way, because British comics are drawn at a different, aspect ratio, right, than American comics are drawn. So the same thing when they were adapting, they would have to literally cut the panels out frame by frame and rearrange them to fit them onto the page properly to do those Hulks and things.
And do that kind of whatever the comics version of like pan and scan old kung fu films on VHS would have been, right?
Exactly. And so then what's great is apparently they started to run out of material, because the pace of a British comic is every single week, right? And back then, the Marvel comics, even things like Hulk and Fantastic Four, didn't necessarily, they sometimes had multiple stories in them. So apparently they ran out by 69. They had run out of material. There was so they started making their own. So apparently there are these Wham versions of the like Hulk stories and stuff that were created in England, not written by Stan Lee, which I would be really interested to see. It brings to mind
what's his name might have been involved in Des Skin, right? Like he seems to have been involved in pretty much all aspects of British comics from a certain point on. I'm wondering.
Yeah, and so okay, it's great that you bring up Des Skin, because that connects to where I was going to go with this. I think one of the most interesting features of this is the whole story about Captain Marvel, right, who is now known as Shazam, and the whole like, maybe that's probably going to be that could be an entire episode by itself. But how it being bought by a British publisher and published in this form, right, and then at a certain point, I don't know what happens. I think it just becomes too expensive, or something happens where they can't publish that. So they bring in Mick Anglo to kind of draft it, and then they lose the rights to that, and then he creates the character of Marvel Man, right? Which he then does, which is basically just a ripoff of Shazam or Captain Marvel. But then that's the one that Des Skin says he has the rights to when he comes along to his Warrior comic and tells Alan Moore oh yeah, I have the rights to that, no problem. If you want to do your, reinvention, whatever
Right.
thing, you go to it. And it turns out that it was all bullshit. He had no rights to the character. He had not. Mick Anglo was furious, I guess. And it's funny because Alan Moore is endlessly talking about how his rights as a creator have been trampled, and and then he almost begins his career by unknowingly trampling the rights of another creator. But anyway, apparently all of this shuts down. They can't print any more of this. So then it's right around this time, 69 apparently, when Janus Stark and a couple of new stories appear in Wham! Exclamation point.
Right.
So this is a bit of a change in the guard. But they still would have had one-page gag strips alongside of sports stories, alongside of weird stuff like Janus Stark.
Created by Tom Tully and Francisco Solane Lopez.
Yes.
And yeah, so I'm not quite, obviously I didn't have Smash magazine, so I'm not quite sure where I read Janus Stark. I'm guessing.
Is it possible it was reprinted in other things? Like, because they're famous for this, right, in England, of like somebody like the 2080 summer special has got a bunch of stuff in it from old issues of Valiant and stuff. And you're like, oh, okay.
Right. I
guess
they might have crept out in some Eagle or something like that.
Yep.
Something along, but again I can't remember because it would have been a grab bag when I was a kid, so I would have subscribed to Eagle for a while when it relaunched, but then also I was picking up old Eagle annuals in like jumble sales and things.
Yeah, me too. That's where these came from.
Yeah. So I'm never quite sure, and I think I must have scored at some point as well, like a run. Like I probably would have had, one, Hotspur or Valiant,
right,
or something like that. So it could have been in there. I mean, who knows? Yeah, but it stuck with me. So basically, the Janus Stark character he's an escapologist, right? He's like a Houdini style, but also like mixed with Mr. Fantastic,
yeah, rubber boned freak show, stuff,
and a Victorian era as well. So that's another thing which kind of gives it a bit of a flavor, right? That makes it appeal to me at least, and I'm sure you as well, right? Because anything in that kind of gaslighty period, right, it has a certain charm.
Yeah.
And so but what struck what I think what anyone remembers from Janus Stark really is because overall it's not that the artwork's great, I have to say. I'm guessing it's all Francisco. Oh yeah, so
anyway. No, it's not. That's what's interesting.
Okay,
I was going to say that in fact, of the three artists who are represented in the volume that we have, Francisco might be my least favorite. Although he does seem to have created the character, and he does the lion's share of the back half of the book. And there's a few panels that are excellent. There's one that if I can find it, I may want to show.
So
but the other two,
we should. Oh, go on.
Okay, well, the other two are Frank Fuentes Mann and Brochal Ramohi.
Okay.
And I think their stories show a better command of draftsmanship. Slightly they're slightly more advanced, I think.
But in general, I like the look of especially Janus Stark himself. He's
He's very vampire-y with that crazy widow's peak and kind of the eyebrows, right?
So we should mention actually what specifically we're talking about. So the Janus Stark stuff has been reprinted by Treasury of British Comics, which is a Rebellion imprint, right?
Yeah.
And they've been putting them out across several volumes. Now they're a little bit not tricky exactly to get, but they're not always at your regular vendors named after big rivers in South America, right? So obviously that can sometimes make a difference in terms of shipping costs to where I am and things like this. And and I wasn't 100% sure because this was a little bit of nostalgia, so I wasn't really sure how much I wanted to invest in it. But then I found that there was you could get a Kindle version, but only of volume 3.
Yeah,
at least
which is
here.
which is weird. I don't know why.
So I decided, well, we'll just jump in straight for volume 3. I didn't think we'd have to go back to the
I imagine that
it probably got
era,
better as it went along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this era of British comics, the like the backstory would have been established in 2 pages. Like everything you needed to know. Like there wasn't going to be some epic, it'd be like this is let's go.
Well, often it's just the first panel, isn't it? It's just JANUS Stark was an escapologist. Boom, you're in, right? But yeah, so the JANUS Stark character is this kind of sleuth as well, right? He's a bit of a Sherlockian kind of sleuth. Escapologist, but also but to a ridiculously to a he's like a contortionist par excellence, right? Like he doesn't have any bones in his body, or
no,
a bone.
No, he can squeeze through like something like yay big.
Yeah,
get his whole body through like a snake and stuff.
And that is what I remember from my childhood reading it. Is the stories are not really that great, to be honest with you, considering how imaginative like the character is. Like all the other stuff around it, like about whatever criminal he's chasing, or with that stuff's fairly bog standard and not that exciting, right? But what stands out is like, suddenly JANUS Stark will have to, literally like travel through a drain pipe.
One of my favorites is where he's slithering up a rabbit's burrow, and there's like a little like pocket of rabbits looking up at him. Like,
great. Yeah, that's nice detail. There's some terrified rabbit. What the fuck? No, they don't normally come in here. They send their dogs in, but but no, that's and I remember as well when I was a kid, I used to just stop and I used to pore over these panels, because it wasn't just that it was the fantastic nature of them, but some of the better renderings are really, really claustrophobic.
Right.
Like I remember like actually going to bed sometimes and just like really thinking about what it would be like. They freaked me out, some of these JANUS. When he's in a particular, like when if he's trapped in a drain pipe or a tunnel or something, and there's a long distance to go that way and there's a long distance to go behind, and he's just in there and he's it really, really freaks
and he does. I mean, apparently it's not comfortable, because a recurring motif is him going like, God damn, this hurts. And whatever way he's squished into something. Yes, I mean, part of the fun of them, I suppose, is, as you said, like sometimes the surrounding story is maybe not, it's not that creative or whatever, but it's just the brief that like Tom Tully, who's the writer, has to every 5 pages be like, okay, so what's he gonna have to squeeze into or out of this week? Like it's there's always going to be a place or a way in which I have to work this central premise in. And it gets increasingly ridiculous and hilarious. Yeah. But yet, somehow the stories always kind of work.
It's like every week when you were watching the A-Team, you'd wonder, which warehouse are they going to get locked in? And what kind of vehicle are they going to build?
Yes. And how will they drug Mr. T?
That's always a glass of milk. Right. On every single time.
Okay, right.
I ain't getting on a goddamn plane. I ain't getting on a goddamn plane. Have a glass of milk.
But I will say, so for example, here's an example of a panel from one of the other 2 artists. I can't remember which one it is, but you will see
that's Dr. Francis P. Gross from Faces of Death.
Yeah, I think so. But it's there's a higher level of realism in a couple of those early stories where that's not actually the main artist, Solanus. It's a bit more of a cartoony approach. Although occasionally he does have really beautiful, like he seems to really get that the dark and light, and it seems like the other artists who are having kind of follow in his mold are also doing that kind of really chiaroscuro, like intense blacks. A lot of these pages are really blacked up.
That's what I like. That's what I like.
In that way that we talked about when we talked about Charlie's War. There's another feature of that I liked a lot, was that Joe, it was not afraid of blacks either. He was right in there with his brush kind of.
From Hell as well has a similar kind of
that's Eddie Trimble, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but apparently the main artist, Solanus, he was Argentinian and repeatedly had to flee Argentina, I guess, because of his comics. I guess he was doing comics that were in some way insulting or annoying the authorities, and he had to go to Spain, where he joined a studio producing comics there. And this is another thing that I think that, British comics, you see a lot of Spanish names. You see a lot of whether they're Spanish, like Carlos Esquera, who's famous for creating the image of Judge Dredd, the design, the costume, or Jose Ortiz, or Jesus Redondo, or Jesus Blasco. You'll see lots of these guys' names when you're reading that generation of comics.
Yes, I always used to wonder why when I was there. Whoa, why are there so many Spanish-sounding names in what looks like a very, all British kind of comic, right? But
I mean, I think it was cheaper. Basically, that was part of it. Like the page, like, rates, I guess, coming out of, if you sent these scripts to Spain or sometimes to Italy, like Massimo Bellardinelli, who worked as an AD, right, and various other English comics. It was just cheaper. These artists were cheaper, but in many cases, as good, or if not better than some of.
I mean, that's the interesting thing as well, is later on when you grew up, and if you did start reading around European or South American comics, whatever you could get your hands on, at least. It was fascinating how it wasn't necessarily a totally different. It was something you were already a little familiar with, like, this isn't immediately alien to me. This kind of seems kind of familiar, right? Like, I've seen stuff that looks like this before.
And in fact, another place where that stuff showed up and I was interested was when I was looking at like American comics, like the old Warren comics, like Creepy and Eerie and stuff, those magazine sized ones. A lot of the artists in there, I was like, I know that's another one of those Argentinian artists or those Spanish artists who was doing stuff for British comics, but also doing much more adulty, beautiful, seductress looking vampire women and stuff, and for those American comics.
Well, when we talked to Robin Bougie the other day as well, he was, we touched on just the tip of English comics, such as the tip of the iceberg, right? And there's a lot of that. I'm with Robin on that in terms of like those like sexy, violent crossover European comics of like the 60s onwards. I am all for delving into some of those. Some of them just look borderline psychotic, and the kind of stuff that you couldn't really get away with as well.
Oh no, no.
Especially to have it on newsstand, right?
Yes, but I will show you. So again, I don't want to as I said, belittle the talent of the main artist, because something like this, I think, is an incredibly beautiful panel, right? And that's Blind Largo, who, as it turns out, is JANUS's Fagin sort of dad, like a street beggar guy who kind of took him in. There's a little bit of a backstory. There's not a huge amount. It really is just what's JANUS going to have to squeeze into through or up or around this week.
But I rather enjoyed it. How did you get on with this collection? I mean, I wasn't I'm not sure if I'm going to rush out and buy all the JANUS Stark volumes, but I like having at least a representative volume that I can look at the scary photos of him trapped in pipes every now and again.
I found it. No, actually, I read it out on my balcony out here, and I found it it passed the time very comfortably. I didn't read it in one go because it's not. I don't think it's meant to be read that way.
It's very samey, isn't it? So
yeah. So it was nice to come back to over a few days and read another 2 stories, maybe, right?
Right.
And I did appreciate, like, there's a cowboy story in there, which kind of comes out of left field suddenly.
Right.
These two episodes, he's in America, and the art in that is actually really strong. That's one of those segments. There's great shots of him naked, actually jumping out of a bull's ring or whatever. And the first part, I was like, that seems weird.
Well, also, I mean, it is worth saying, just beyond the, I mean, I'm very, very grateful and pleased that Rebellion, Treasury of British Comics, have gone to the trouble of, and we're talking another one of their volumes soon, right? But
yes, yeah.
But they are doing a good work, and this is I think this is the first one of theirs that I actually picked up and had a look at, and no, it's an invaluable. I mean, because there's, you know, like we were saying, you know, people know a lot about certain types of American, like either superhero comics or EC or even, you know, the Comix underground stuff, Robert Graham stuff like that.
Yeah.
And as well, I think Japan has its own international mega fandom who are, you know, slowly going through the enormous task of translating all the great Japanese comics into English and all that. Yeah. But I feel as if British comics slightly over the years have had a bit of short thrift, and growing up reading British comics, it's not just a nostalgia thing. I think it's just like, you know, I can see the value in it, and there's a lot of great work, and outside of maybe certain you know, fringe online groups or whatever, I still don't think British comics necessarily get their
fair due.
Yeah. Well, what do you think?
I would agree. I did laugh though. I was trying to think at the end of the book. I was like, I was reading something else on the internet, and you know, the Bechdel test came up, and I was like, is there a single woman drawn even in any of the panels of Janus Stark? And I really had a hard time being like, I don't know, maybe in the background somewhere, but like certainly no woman ever spoke a word in the entire story. Like, you know, I was like, that's kind of hilarious.
How far you want to take Janus Stark's fear of being trapped in tight spaces as well, right?
Yes. Like, or the fact that he could certainly satisfy any urges he had, I would imagine, without recourse to the fair sex.
Oh, we're back to Anna Stark again now.
Yes, I think so. But I was going to say, so one last thing, I'd like to just talk briefly about Tom Tully, who is the guy who wrote this, right? Tom Tully was apparently the most prolific, like, script writer in British comics. He churned out apparently more stuff than anybody, and he was a guy famous for taking a premise and running it into the ground. Like, he would run, like, whereas another writer would be like, okay, I could probably get 25-page increments out of this. He'll be like, I'm going to run this for 76, like, until people are so tired of it that they don't want to see it anymore.
He worked on Roy of the Rovers, right?
Well, that's what, yes. So probably his most famous thing is he was the longest running writer on Roy of the Rovers, which, if you are not English, you may not know, is the inspiration for Billy the Fish. So I'm sure.
Oh yeah, there we go. Everyone knows what you're talking about now. Why didn't you say so before? Billy the Fish, of course.
was a soccer comic. Yeah, so he wrote that. But I know him best because, or through, I guess, 2000 AD, unsurprisingly, right? So where he wrote a couple of dodgy stories for the first few years, and then kind of, I think he was one of those people who they were like, yeah, you maybe stick to your sports comics, Tom, which that's all he wrote for 2000 AD. He wrote 3 stories for 2000 AD. He wrote the Harlem Heroes. He wrote the Mean Arena, and he wrote Inferno, which was actually just a follow-up to the Harlem Heroes. All of which, and then he wrote another one for Valiant, I think, called Spinball, which was yet another, like, So he clearly saw the movie Rollerball and was like, I can get 4 to 5 different stories out of this, and then did. And it actually followed up when I was reading about Mean Arena, because I remembered that. That's the one where this guy's running around like basically a bombed out kind of hellscape New York, playing some sort of like in full battle armor, like killing other guys while trying to like to get a football through a net. It was like basically
what was that Sega Mega Drive game that looked like that, where you had to put you had like 4 goals around the corner and you had to put like a metal ball again where you
basically he just did that. He had that premise, and that was his science fiction premise, was doing a football story where every issue ended with the guy scoring a goal and killing a guy at the same time. But apparently not only did he do the same thing in like 4 different versions of the same comics, but it was a ripoff of a novel called Killer Bowl by Gary K. Wolfe, which I kind of want to read now.
Yes.
Gary K. Wolfe was the guy who also wrote Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, but I'm wondering as well if it's more interesting than, because I have, within the past few years, I happen to have read the original. So Rollerball is based on a series of short stories, right, rather than a novel.
Right.
And they're quite boring. So I'm wondering if that might be
looks a bit trashier, maybe.
Yeah.
It was.
You say Killer Ball or Killer Bowl?
Killer Bowl.
Okay,
so
I'm
like
it down for a.
Gary K. Wolfe, the author of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. His first book was Killer Bowl.
He also did The Steel Claw, right? Which is something I'm not overly familiar with. But looking it up here on Wikipedia, apparently Steel Claw achieved cult status in India.
That's fascinating. Well, so I mean, we're all out of time on this thing. Should we continue for another 5 minutes, or should we just say?
Depends how. Do you have much to say?
I was just going to say it apparently continued in France for years after. So JANUS continued in France for nearly a decade after it was done in England.
He looks a bit weird. French, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. And I think that's all we have to say.
Yeah.
So, if you need to squeeze yourself into a very small place, you know where to go to get your tips, your how-tos. It is in the work of Tom Tully's Janus Stark.
Sacre bleu!